Today, we're going to set the stage for a topic that we as a church are going to be addressing again throughout the year in many different formats. And that topic that we're going to talk about is unity and division in the church. I want to talk this morning about why division is bad, what we want to see instead of it, and how to avoid it. I don't know if you've thought about it yet, but we have a major national election cycle coming up at the end of 2024. Some of us might be excited about that. Others of you just died a little on the inside, being reminded about everything that you're going to have to go through in the next year. See, we're already dealing with division. And maybe you haven't noticed lately, but our political environment has become incredibly divided and hostile in recent years. Don't get me wrong, it's always been there. There's always been elements of division throughout our history as a country. It comes with being a democracy. But it feels like now it's a feature instead of a bug. It feels sometimes like there are a lot of folks cheering on the splintering of our political process. And there's a lot that Christians can and should say about that reality. But we're not going to do it this morning. That's not what we're focusing on. What we're going to focus on is how that same cultural splintering has affected the church as a whole in our country, and especially how it's affected individual congregations like ours. A little over 2 years ago, as these divisions started to become more and more visible in more and more churches, as we started to come out of COVID and see the results of that, Michael Graham, a staff writer with the Gospel Coalition, wrote an article that's become kind of a touch point called The Six-Way Fracturing of Evangelicalism. Graham basically speculated that evangelical Christianity in our country was fracturing, splintering, and he broke it down into 6 groups based on the axes of how our churches engaged or didn't with outside political issues, and how churches engaged or didn't with scandals, embarrassments, and failures going on inside of the church. I'm not going to lecture you this morning on the details of how their numbering system worked or so on and so forth, except to say that they broke it down into 6 numbers, 1 to 6, that kind of moved on a spectrum up and down. You might be saying, John, that's very interesting. I'm just kidding. It's not interesting at all. How does that apply to me? Well, this is how it applies to us today. We as a denomination, as a group of churches, and we as an individual church, are seeking to be something that Graham's research and experience says basically can't exist anymore. Because towards the end of that article, Graham wrote, and as we've sadly seen, it has happened in recent years often, Graham said Christians would continue to sort themselves into churches that fit them like a glove, that insulated them from outside opinions, including even from other Christians who didn't fit into their exact corner along the lines that our culture has been breaking us down into. He argued that individual churches would only be able to survive without division if they were primarily composed of 2 of those 6 numbers that were next to each other on the spectrum. So basically he said churches aren't going to survive unless they're a 2 and 3 church. They're a 4 and 5 church, et cetera, et cetera. You can only have 2 of those groups. Otherwise you'll splinter, you'll fracture, you'll divide, you'll get broken up. He postulated that even denominations as a whole could only survive a 3-number group, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, etc., without breaking apart. The reality is that for most of American Christianity, this prediction has been proven pretty accurate in recent years, as we've seen more and more splintering, even in the largest groups of churches that had previously been tied together in our country. But our denomination and our particular church have so far managed to largely hold tightly to each other, despite the cultural forces arrayed against our unity. Again, I'm not going to use more time to define those numbers for you, except we'll make a link to that article available on the church social media, and if you want it directly from the office, you can email the office and we'll get that to you. But from my personal conversations with many of you over these last couple years, I know that we as a church have a full 4 or even 5 number range on that gap that Michael Graham gives that are actively involved together here at Hope on any given Sunday. And remember, Graham predicted that no church would be able to survive a spread larger than 2 numbers. We have 4 or 5 worshiping together on a regular basis. I think the unity that God has given us as a congregation is a gift and a blessing, and I think it is critical going into a season of great cultural division as we look at the upcoming election, that we do not take this blessing for granted. So this morning, we're going to look at 3 different passages that are going to answer 3 different questions for us. First, why should we avoid division? Second, what does the alternative look like? What does Christian unity look like? And finally, how do we pursue it? How do we make Christian unity happen? So let's start with that first question in Ezra chapter 3. Why should we avoid division? What's going on here in our passage, because we're only going to read a few verses, the book of Ezra is about the exiles returning from exile in Persia. They've been allowed to go back to begin rebuilding the temple. And so they've started building, they've started putting the logistics together to make that happen after the first temple was destroyed in the Babylonian captivity. They've gone back to their home in Jerusalem, they've started rebuilding, and our passage takes place as the altar has been completed, and then the foundation is just about to be finished for this new temple. Let's start reading in Ezra 3, verse 10. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the son of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord, according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and the heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, the first temple, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many others shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and their sound was heard far away. So we've got 2 different groups going on here. We've got those who are excited about what God is doing. They're seeing this new temple foundation being laid. But there's a second group who remembers the first temple. And when the second temple's foundation gets laid, it's tiny compared to the old one. It's probably a quarter of the size of the first temple. And they're sad. They're sad at what has been broken. It's really important to acknowledge that the Bible here, in the passage, the loss is just as real as the joy. The Bible doesn't say which of them were right. It says both of them were real. They were feeling what they were feeling. Shay Lin is a Christian musician and author, and he said, when there are people who love Jesus and the Bible on the other side of any argument, we shouldn't automatically assume that we're the ones who have it correct, that we're in alignment with Jesus. In fact, both of us might be wrong. Jesus had a way of indicting and offending everybody at some point in his ministry. Are we the special ones with whom Jesus just happens to agree at every point? That's the mistake that both of these 2 groups in our passage make. They both assume that they are seeing everything perfectly and that their perspective is the one that everybody should have. The older group in our passage shows that nostalgia can be a great enemy to unity, because nostalgia can make temples that are beautiful in their own right look like cheap knockoffs of a remembered perfection, whether it was actually perfect or not. But the joyful celebrants, the younger generation, fail here too, because they don't pause. They don't make space for the sadness of their elders. They don't temporarily cease their celebration to sit with the mourners, to hear their stories, to acknowledge their pain, to celebrate the beauty that was lost with the destruction of the first temple. So the challenge and the failure here in our passage is largely one of empathy. When I am asked to see a new work to accept one that to my eyes seems less grand than the one that I remember, but I see the joy and the exultation of people around me who didn't know the first building the way I did, who are excited and overjoyed by that new work that God is doing. Will I privilege my own point of view and continue to weep, or will I seek empathy that I need to see through those joyful eyes and to accept their joy as my own, to put others first by putting their desire, their loves ahead of my own? And when I'm ecstatic and everything is going great and wonderfully and life is amazing, will I hear the weeping of the person whose heart is breaking, even if it's for the same reason that mine is exulting? Because if we don't, there's a serious risk of bad consequences. We've kind of described the background. We know what's happening. The consequences of this division here is that in the next few chapters of Ezra, in the book of Haggai, which was written about 17 years later, we look and nothing's happened. The temple is still exactly where it was. The altar is done, the foundation is done, and nothing else has been done to it. The people of Jerusalem had given themselves over to everything else that they wanted to do in life. They had begun building fine houses for themselves rather than finishing the temple project. The division of the generations had gained the upper hand and brought about paralysis in God's people. Older believers were heard to say such things as, "Oh, it was so much better in my day. If only we could go back there. If only to discourage and drain the energy from those who showed enthusiasm for the project." The younger generation wondered, what's the point in trying if my elders, whom I love and respect, can't find anything good to say about the results when I do? And if the older generation had poisoned the process here in our passage with nostalgia and pessimism, the younger generation fails because they fail the test of perseverance. As soon as tough stuff emerges, as soon as the rough patch of the road shows up, they give up on what's hard, building the temple, and get busy building fine homes for themselves, while the temple remains in a state of half-readiness. What we're seeing here is one generation who gets caught on an inordinate focus on the past, and another who can't see past the present. And the reality is they needed each other. That older generation needed the joy and the passion of the younger generation. And the younger generation needed the experience of perseverance that they could get from the older. That older generation had survived a lifetime living in exile. If they remembered the first temple, that means they had survived 70 years in exile and signed up to move hundreds of miles to go help rebuild Jerusalem. The younger generation needed that experience, but they were divided by their inability to empathize with each other. Nostalgia and dissatisfaction on one hand, but a lack of empathy and perseverance on the other cut them off from each other. And this is the important thing to see. Everybody lost because of it. Division isn't something where there ends up being a winner and loser. It just ends up being a lot of losers. That's how it works. Now, this is a moment where we take a quick break before we move on to do a don't hear what I'm not saying. There are times where division is necessary. If there is an abusive leader loose in the church, protected by a group of cronies, yes, division might be necessary to get rid of that person. We're in a church that split from a denomination 10 years ago. There are times where the theological bonds just cannot hold anymore, and we have to say, you don't believe the same things we believe, and so God bless you, but we can't be here anymore. What we're talking about here this morning is division that is created because of us privileging our cultural loyalties, our preferences, our perspectives, and just our tastes and wants and desires over those of everybody else around us. That's the kind of division we're talking about. So how do we avoid this kind of pitfall? How do we as a church bridge this divide, but every other subtle barrier that would seek to divide us from one another and prevent us from accomplishing the work that God has set before us in our community? We need to embrace the Bible's vision for unity, and I think we find that in the passage that Krishan read a few minutes ago. So we're going to go back to 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 to 22. 1 Corinthians 12, 12 to 22. We'll have it up there on the screen. This is me learning not to use tissue paper as bookmarks. They just fall apart and you can't actually grab anything there. For just as the body is one and has many members, members means parts of the body in here, has many members, and as all the members of the body, though many are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as He chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? But as it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. This passage does a fantastic job of distinguishing what the world thinks unity looks like from biblical unity. As I look at the culture around us and the way that it views the idea of unity, what it thinks unity looks like, I don't actually see what the Bible describes as unity. I see what I would define as uniformity. Think of what some people today call cancel culture, which is really just the application of shame on a widespread basis. An attempt to force people into unity, but really it's enforcing uniformity. The funny thing about cancel culture is this: it doesn't work across social groups. If you and I share little or no social overlap and you cancel me, I probably am not even going to know that it's happening. Like, I mean, good for you. I hope you get some satisfaction out of that. It's not going to affect me in any way, shape, or form. If the session gets an email tomorrow from Bob in North Dakota, who has no ties to the church, no ties to me, but wants me fired for what he saw me say in the sermon today, they would, I think, and should laugh it off as one of those things that happens in the internet age and move on. Be a different question if it was a bunch of people from inside the church, because we have those connections to each other. We have that love for each other. We have that bond. Cancel culture isn't for our enemies. It's for keeping our allies in line. This is kind of our cultural idea of unity. It's uniformity. Cancel culture isn't used by activists over here lobbing bombs over there. It's by extremists over here trying to get the people right here to get closer in line with them or keep them from straying to the other side. That's our world's idea of unity. And don't be fooled into thinking this is only an issue on one side or another of any debate or discussion or division that we're having today. This is a cultural change that is happening, which means it's affecting all of us. In a lot of ways, this is just our Western culture becoming more like Eastern cultures have always been. Shame and honor focused. Very important to not be shamed in the eyes of others. In fact, that's kind of making us more like the cultures into which the scriptures were written. When Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, he was writing to a culture that knew all about shame. It was a culture in which your place in society was defined by your family, your background, your belonging to a community, and where being on the outside socially would have meant impoverishment or even death. Paul isn't giving this definition of unity into some sort of utopia. This is the real world. They felt the pressure to express unity via uniformity as well, but Paul says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And in fact, real unity cannot be built on uniformity. Paul could have used a different metaphor here. He could have said, hey, when you're building a building, you want all of the stones to be from the same quarry so that they all look good. He's used the analogy before about how we all as Christians are stones being built up into a temple. He could use that here. He could say, if you're on a sports team, you want all of your jerseys to match so that your quarterback doesn't throw it to the cornerback on the other team. He could say, if you're painting a road, you need all the lines and all the signs to mean the same thing, or else there will be chaos. Those aren't the analogies he uses. He intentionally leans into an analogy that highlights that true good unity exists when people who are different, who are diverse, who are not exactly the same, come together and form it. Verses 17 to 19, I think, are my favorite little summary of this, where it says, if the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, a single part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. If we were all the same, where would we be? It's the hypothetical that Paul offers here. I'll tell you this. If y'all were the same Christian that I am, this place would not look anywhere near as good as it does because I have the aesthetic sense of a blind donkey. Okay? This place would not look anywhere near as good as it did if all of you were the same as me. If all of you were the same as me, we would probably all be shivering this morning because the heat would be broken, because I can barely keep up on the maintenance for my one-family house, let alone all the craziness that has to be done around this place to keep everything working on a regular basis. I would be lost on what this place requires without Sam and Scott and the facilities committee all coming alongside me. I could go on and on telling you about all of my weaknesses that would create a really weird church if we were all the same, but I feel adequately humbled now, so we're going to go ahead and move on to a different thing. But I think that's the point that Paul is getting across, right? He's saying if you're being honest with yourself, if you're seeing the way that you need other people who aren't exactly like you, it should be helping you as a Christian to grow in a healthy humility. If we acknowledge our limitations, our weaknesses, if we know that we can't make it on our own or even just with people who are exactly like us, it helps us. It opens us up. It helps us to grow as Christians. It shows us that we need different points of view to see with clarity the ever-changing situations that the world is going to throw at us in the years to come. We need different skill sets to tackle the different challenges that the mission of God is going to put in front of us as he calls us to spread the word of God, of the gospel among the nations. We even need the different temperaments and personalities that he's given us. We need fiery, passionate, explosive go-getters who are going to do the Kool-Aid man through every wall that gets in the way between them and the mission that God has placed before them. And we need cautious people who are going to be the get-back coach for those people and help them to watch out for land. Have you ever seen that in a football game? The really passionate coaches have a guy whose job is to grab the back of their belt or hold on to them so that they don't get a flag for going too far out onto the field. Anyway, we need both of those people. We need the fiery coach and we need the get-back coach, holding us each other accountable and watching out for the things that are going on in the mission that God has given us. We need folks who speak the truth boldly and people who listen with compassion, because we're going to need to do a lot of both of those in the year to come, and we need to do some of them sometime and some of them the other, and we need to learn from each other what that looks like. This passage tells us what our unity should look like. Not division, but different and diverse people united by a common belief in God and given a mission by God to help each other's weaknesses, to enhance each other's strengths, and to give the gospel out into the community around us. We're going to close this morning by looking at one last passage that gives us an idea of how we can build that type of unity around us. What is the foundation, and then how do we build off of that foundation? So we're going to read 1 Peter 4, verses 8 through 11. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Amen. So verses 10 through 11 restate in kind of a much shorter package what we heard from Paul back in 1 Corinthians 12. Whatever varied ability, gift, etc. you have, use it for the good of the people around you. But here Peter gives us something interesting. He gives us a foundation and kind of a guideline for how to be building a unity where we are able to do that. And I want to make sure we see two things about it this morning. The first is it has to be built on the gospel. It has to be built on Jesus. Verse 8 there says, above all, keep loving each other. Keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. That's an interesting phrase there. It's been used in the past to try to say, well, you're just supposed to ignore other people's sins, or you're just supposed to ignore when bad things happen to you, or this, that, or the other. I don't think that's really what it's getting across here. This is pushing us back to the one love that can truly cover over sin. This is pushing us back to Jesus. This is saying all of this other stuff, all this unity for you as a church, all the things that I'm going to tell you to do have to be built on the love that can cover over sin. The blood of Jesus that has been paid to pay the price for our ransom, to take away the condemnation that we deserve because of our selfishness, our greed, our pride, so on and so forth. And in that, it's telling us that we're supposed to be transformed by that love into living examples of the gospel in our relationship with one another. Imagine if when we were hurt, our instinct was to seek reconciliation, to forgive within ourselves, yes, but even to have a hard conversation with the person who's hurt us so that we can rebuild that relationship and not just cast it off to the side as dead weight. Imagine if we as Christians, when we heard another Christian in the church espousing views that didn't fit our side of the social and political spectrum, our knee-jerk reaction wasn't to condemn them, but to invite them for a conversation and to ask to learn more about why they think what they do, or even just to find out if we heard them right in the first place. Imagine if all of our relationships with one another were avidly seeking chances to cover those relationships in the love of God that we see in the gospel. The gospel is the only foundation that works for our Christian unity. It is for God so loved the world that transforms us into people who can really love each other. So that's the foundation. And then Peter goes on to kind of talk about the how. How do you build? If you have the foundation, what is the pattern that you're using to build off of? And it's a really funny answer. It's not the one that I think I would normally expect. But in verse 9, he says the answer to build on the foundation for unity is hospitality. Reading verse 9. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. I think that's only 5 words in the Greek, if I remember right. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. It's a really simple, really short, concise command. But it's really interesting too, because specifically, Peter is talking about what's going on within the context of the church. This whole passage is, hey, this is how you hold together. This is how you connect, so on and so forth. But the word hospitality is, we translate it from a Greek word that literally means love for strangers. So how am I supposed to love strangers within the church? I think if we pair it with Peter's discussion in verse 10 about the varied grace of God, it's saying Christians love and build relationship with the other Christians in your church who are in some way, shape, or form not like you. I think this is the foundational way that we build on the foundation of gospel unity that we have as Christians. We have to connect to each other. And it's important to note, what does it mean when the Bible talks about hospitality? The New Testament scholar Bruce Waltke wrote, "Hospitality in the Bible is not entertaining. It is enlarging and extending ourselves just as we enlarge and extend our tables. Hospitality without the inner stretching of the heart becomes that inferior product called entertainment." So it's not that entertainment isn't part of it. Having people over for food, getting together, spending time together. He says, yes, that's part of it. But there has to be an inner stretching that is going on with that, where it's saying, not only am I inviting this person in to my house, I am inviting them into my heart. That sounds so cheesy, but it's true. Like, that's what Peter is getting at here. You have to be bringing people into your care, to your love. You have to be learning about them and learning to care about the things that matter in their lives. We expand our worlds through prayer and care for others. Mother Teresa once said, "The problem with the world is that we draw the circle of our family too small." And this is kind of my last reality punch for the morning. The reality is, we aren't good at this as a church. I think a big part of that is because our culture isn't good at this. We live in an underfriended age. You find it in any survey or poll that they put out about depression, anxiety, etc. Loneliness is this huge problem. We are living in an underfriended culture that struggles to form real bonds and help people to connect. Absolutely. And within that larger culture, we live in a Southern culture where we tend to do a great job being friendly, but often struggle to make friends. Sarah and I moved to Charlotte for seminary when we were, 23, 24, somewhere in there. We were expecting and we're just about to have Thea, our first kid. And we stepped into an EPC church down there that ended up being our home for a couple of years. We loved many, many things about the church. I still use the welcome that I got my first Sunday in that church as like the example in my head of what is the perfect way to pull in a new person and make them feel welcomed. And then nothing changed for months. It was a great first experience. And this is kind of how we are as a church too. From talking to many of you who are newer, from talking to those of you who have been here forever. We're a great first experience for that first month or so. We have to figure out, how do we break through on that next step? How do we go from being friendly to making new friends within the church? So this is my challenge for us in this new year. Find some Christians who are different from you in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they're at a different stage in their life journey. Maybe they're on the other side of the political spectrum from you, or they're on a totally different side of the socioeconomic spectrum from you. I don't know what that looks like, but find some folks in the church who are different from you in some way, shape, or form, and make some new friends this year. I heard a story shared by a Baptist pastor a few months ago who said that years back, there was a new family who joined their church. And week 1 happened, and they got greeted by everyone and welcomed by everyone, but then week 2 happened, and week 3 happened, and week 4 happened, and no one really connected to them. Nobody invited them over. Nobody became their friend. And you know what happened? They just said, well, we'll do it. I actually like this story turns a little bit here. They said, okay, then I guess that's our job now. And they started inviting everybody else in the church over to their place for meals. The pastor said that today, years later, most of their church has at least been invited into the home of this family. The pastor said that family single-handedly changed the culture of their church over those years. And he prayed, Lord, help us to be for others what we wish others could be for us.